Hey everyone, how you doing? I wanted to quickly talk about a topic that's been going around the last couple of days because many states have been making some decisions about what school might look like next year. Now, I've been pondering this for the last couple of weeks, actually probably since back in April. And I do have some thoughts about it, but I want to try to utilize those skills that I try to teach in my AP US history class, and that is identifying those different points of view and trying to put things into context. So we're going to do that and talk about the pros and cons of the three different models, either fully going back to normal and going back to school, hybrid model, and also online learning. Kind of try to take a look at the pros and cons of that. And then at the very end, I'll tell you which one that I prefer. So just for starters, states, counties, and local school districts are making those decisions right now, and they're sending out a lot of surveys. Like for instance, in my school district, families got surveys about what they prefer for next year, and one for teachers is coming out very soon as well. In my home state of Wisconsin, plus I've seen several other states come out with these large plans about how schools can get back going and trying to abide by like the CDC, which comes with like a lot of restrictions and maybe some difficulties too that we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so let's try to put some context to it. So first off, we all know school was halted across the country in mid-March, and most of the country did not return. There's a few places, especially in some rural areas in the country, where school did return, but most places, in-person instruction never returned for the whole entire country. Many went to distance learning. My school district did go to distance learning. However, some school districts did not go to distance learning. They just, completely like shut it all down altogether in mid-March. A lot of the reason was maybe they didn't have the capacity to do that. Students didn't have access or devices, or maybe they just thought that it was an equity issue, or maybe some students could learn online, but others didn't have that kind of access to it. So some school districts were just completely done in mid-March. Okay, and before jumping into the different options here for school next year, I want to just kind of give a little more context too for where we are at with coronavirus. Okay, so daily new cases, they rose up to a peak of over 30,000 in late March, early April. And then, it started to go down a bit on average throughout May. And we've kind of seen another recent spike in the last week or so. So we've been hovering between this 20,000 to a little over 30,000 plus cases a day for several months now. And that's something to keep in mind as we think about what is the next school year going to be like. On a positive trend, we see here the daily deaths, and that went up a lot early on in March and then peaked there in early April and mid-April, and then started going down in May, and it's been decreasing over time. Now, this is probably because we're testing more and more people. I know beforehand from friends who I have working in hospitals, it was very difficult to get tests early on in like March and April, and they only tested those who were really, really sick. And now they're testing a lot more people. So we see this death rate, which is great, dropping. Another thing that might play a big role in an individual state's decision is where they're at right now in their own state when it comes to the coronavirus. And as of today, June 23rd, we see that some states are having their own little peaks right now, like California, Texas, and Florida. And you see pretty high amounts of cases there, 5,500 for California yesterday, 5,100 for Texas, and almost 3,000 for Florida. So that might influence whether an individual state is going to go to distance learning, hybrid, or back to full face-to-face. Another thing to kind of keep in mind as far as context when it comes to schools making decisions are the demographics behind the virus and everything. So the death rate overall, there's many different estimates. There's some that are fairly high, like well above 5%, and then I've seen some that are like under 1%. And a lot of these are from reputable sources. I think it depends on how you count the mortality or fatality rate from it. It is clear that it is more deadly than the flu, though. Now, one good thing is it doesn't, when it comes to schools, is younger people, children and people up to their teens, they seem to not be nearly as affected as older folks, especially the elderly and other people with pre-existing conditions. The death rates for folks who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s is very high. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is this virus in America tends to be affecting minorities more. The death rate for Black people is twice as high as the average overall. And it also impacts urban areas. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory because urban areas have denser, population cores, and it's just a lot of people close to each other, contacting things that they had touched, people breathing around each other. All of that is going to add to an urban area having higher amounts of cases than rural areas. And there's other factors too that I don't really want to get too much into, but one interesting one is actually blood type. Certain blood types seem to have less of an effect. The virus has less of an effect on them than other blood types. Okay, last thing before we get into the three different options are I just want to talk about how distance learning went from mid-March until now. So for me personally, it actually went pretty well. I have a good LMS, my school district does, called Canvas, that I was able to adapt really efficiently and really well to an online learning model. And my students were well connected. They all had Chromebooks issued from the school. The students that did not have internet access, the school would give them hotspots. And I kind of saw it coming like a few days in advance. And so I was preparing my students for if school is going to be called off. And eventually, when it was, all my students were pretty well prepared for what to know, what to do, all the way up till spring break. And at the end of the whole year, I got some pretty good feedback from students. They said they knew kind of what to do, where to go on Canvas. And overall, I didn't see a huge drop off from students who just kind of disappeared. Most of my students stayed on task, and so it went well for me. However, I've seen a lot of recent articles for a lot of schools that it did not go too well with. And and they kind of tell a different tale. There was a recent one in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago. I don't know how they got the statistics already, but they're basically saying that a lot of learning was lost in those couple of months that we went to distance learning. So there were significant struggles for a lot of people, a lot of teachers, a lot of students from mid-March until recently. Okay, finally, let's get into the three different options. So the first option is to just continue on with distance learning. What are some of the pros of that? Well, we have, of course, the decreased spread of the virus. You have students, less students getting together in a huge area. Like my high school is about 1,400 students. And so you're keeping all of them separate. And so you're probably keeping that spread of the virus down. So if you don't have all these students in one place, spreading their germs to each other, they most likely won't be bringing it home to their parents or grandparents. Next is, one positive thing looking much further down the road is we are kind of preparing students for the eventuality that they do end up taking online classes later on. Many people, many adults take part of their college classes online, or their whole college is online. My master's degree, it was kind of a hybrid version, but most of it, like 90% of it, was online. So this is kind of like a, preparation a little bit for that online world that a lot of people end up seeing later on in life. And there are a few that excel at it. I had a few students that actually preferred the online world. It wasn't many, but some students have a lot of anxiety with school, and when they were actually at home, they found they could better focus on things. And so for a couple of my students, they actually did much better with the online format. Okay, now let's talk about the cons. And the biggest one are the equity issues. Look, everyone's home life is very different. Some parents are working. Some people's home life is just not very good. And actually school is like their safe place. That might be for a lot of students. And so, the learning environment at a home for distance learning, it might be, not good for some folks, but excellent for others. Some people have the means to, hire tutors, or the parents themselves. One of them can stay home and work with the children on their work and everything. Others, that might not be an option. I knew several of my students, they had to stay home and watch their younger siblings while their parents were at work during the day. And it was very, very difficult for them. And there's also, of course, the access issue. I think some people might understand, but in rural areas especially, there are some real issues with people being able to access the internet. And if you don't have access to the internet and or a device, it's really hard to do distance learning. And some school districts don't have the means to be able to provide that to students. Okay, another major aspect is socialization and the activities that students would be missing. I know from that mid-March to May, so many of my students, especially my freshmen who did not have a means to, drive and see friends or whatever, they were really feeling distant from everybody. And that can be a major problem with your mental health as well. While certain students, as I said before, excelled with not being at school with the social anxiety, for many other students, it made them very sad and depressed to not see their students interact with other people, physically. And we already know this, but some districts were not really equipped, or are still not really equipped, for distance learning. And, funding for districts is probably going to be drying up a lot with the decrease in the economy, and that's going to be less tax dollars going in. So it's going to be really hard for districts to all of a sudden splurge on devices and hotspots and everything like that for students to all of a sudden turn around and do distance learning for everyone. So this might be very difficult for some districts. And it also might be very difficult for some teachers. There might be a capacity gap. And I know even at my school, there is definitely a capacity gap between some teachers and other teachers when it comes to effectively delivering online instruction. And I think if we look at it overall, while there are some pros to online learning, and I actually teach summer school, e-school, Overall, in general, it's inferior to face-to-face instruction. That instant feedback, that great conversation, the socialization that you get from being in a classroom, being in a safe environment, in a learning environment for everyone. Overall, if we could go back to normal school, if we could just wash the virus away, I think that we would do that immediately. Now on to the second option, which is a hybrid option. And there are some different models when it comes to this. So one person saying a hybrid might mean something different than another person. A couple of things that my home state of Wisconsin has suggested is one of them is you could do a 4-day week. So students would come Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday would be a deep clean of the school. Students then come back Thursday and Friday and a deep clean of the school again over the weekend. You would have some distance learning going on Wednesday then. And, so you'd kind of have just a 4-day week for some extra deep cleaning at the school. Another option is something called AB, where you have an A group of students come in like Monday, Wednesday, Friday for week 1. And then the next week they come in Tuesday, Thursday. And then there's a B group of students that come in Tuesday, Thursday, and the second week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And you just kind of flip back and forth. Both students would have like distance learning on those days that they're not at school. And that is a way that you could, a pro that would be cutting down the amount of students who are actually in the school at the same time. Now, students, with a hybrid option are going to get some socialization. It's not like the distance learning one where kids are never seeing each other. So this is a good option when it comes to that. And there are clear instructions. You have that face-to-face time with students. So for those distance learning days, you can give those clear instructions face-to-face the previous day. So that'd be a great kind of pro for a hybrid option. There are some cons to it as well. The first one being is the difficulty it would be for working parents. Those days that students are not at school, that Wednesday for the deep cleaning day or the AB, they might not be at school for 2 or 3 days out of the week. You have to find some alternative options. And it's hard to find that part-time care. Some people might have relatives they can send them to, but a lot of people do not. So you're probably going to be paying for some sort of daycare or some babysitter that might be overwhelmed with a whole bunch of kids at their place. Then you're kind of defeating the whole purpose of the hybrid, as if you have a bunch of kids who are then just gathering with different kids at a babysitter or childcare place. So it's not totally going, it's not cutting down the amount of contact that kids have. And of course, we still have the equity issue too. For those students who don't have parents at home that can help them out or don't have a good home life or whatever it may be, it will make it more difficult for those students, when they're doing the distance learning on those days they're not at school. There's also pressure and expenses on the school to be virus-free. Now, this is going to be the same for the last option, which is just going back to normal. But, if there's an outbreak at a school, it might shut the whole school down. And then instead of hybrid, you're just going fully back to distance learning, except you're doing it really abruptly. So if a teacher gets it or some student gets it, you're probably going to have to shut down the whole school for a couple of weeks. Now, being a teacher, one thing that I think about with this is I think this would be the most difficult option on teachers because you're basically having them set up both an online kind of learning platform and also face-to-face, especially if it's that AB option where you see some students some days and other students the other days. That is going to be pretty hard on teachers. And then also you have that risk factor for teachers too. Of course, this is going to be the same with going back to normal, but some teachers are not in the greatest of health. They might be bringing it back. They might be living with someone else who's not in the greatest of health or their parents or whoever. And so there's a big risk factors there, for the teachers and the rest of the staff at a school. Okay, now the final option, which is going back to normal. And when I mean normal, I mean face-to-face, albeit I'm sure many schools would be taking precautions like possibly face masks and a lot of sanitation. So what are some of the pros for this? For equity, this is easily the best option. You're providing a safe learning environment. Students are getting instruction every single day, and you get that immediate feedback. You get the socialization, you get the activities, all of that. And you also have the big help for working parents. That is something that's going to really help the economy get back going again. And for families who are really struggling right now and the parents work during the day, having that school option there will alleviate a lot of stress for them as well. Okay, so some of the cons. Obviously, this option is the most conducive to the spread of the virus. Whether it's kindergarten kids in a classroom slobbering all over the place, or giant high schools with students touching the same doorknobs, breathing on each other, all those different things, this is going to be the most conducive for the spread of the virus. And that's the biggest con here. It's also hazardous for the school and families too. Think about students with parents or grandparents who are not in the best shape health-wise. This could possibly lead to more deaths as well. Aside from that, there are some other cons to it as well. There is a lot of pressure on schools to maintain a virus-free environment. So, there might be some things that I know some parents don't want, and I'm sure some students wouldn't want too, and that is like wearing a face mask throughout the entire day. And finally, what happens when a staff member gets sick or a student gets sick? Do you abruptly shut down the whole school for a couple of weeks? And then it'd be just immediate too, and you wouldn't really have time to set up that distance learning. So is there just gonna be no learning for 2 weeks, completely? So that is another pretty sizable con. When you're thinking about going back to normal, what happens if the virus spreads within the community or the school? That's going to be a really, rough kind of turnaround to go straight from back to normal to distance learning immediately without any kind of preparation. Finally, I want to give my own personal thoughts. Okay, so I totally understand that, there are very good arguments against my own preference, and my own preference is the last one. I am fine. I think I can do online learning or a hybrid model, but my love is for being in the classroom, in front of my students, interacting with my students. That's what I really love about teaching. And, so that would be my overall preference. Again, granted, I totally understand the arguments against it, being more dangerous for spreading the virus and everything. But, my personal preference would be the last one. And I think that is also the best one when it comes to equity and making sure that everyone has a safe learning environment. But what are your thoughts on it? What are some of the things I might have missed in this video? Feel free to comment below, or, do you have a preference for one of the other models like hybrid or for, complete distance learning? I would love to see a great discussion below. Also, if you please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's over summertime and not a lot of people are watching the history videos. And also, for those of the people that just got finished with APUSH, if you could share this channel with people who are taking APUSH next year, and so they can get some of that extra help and also help grow my channel as well. That's all I have for this video. Stay healthy, and we'll see where this goes for next school year.